welcome to Exhibit Extras, where we talk about the exhibit making process and some of the exhibits that are coming out at the Fletcher Museum and around the region. So today we're going to talk with Spenser Brenner, the exhibition coordinator at the Reece Museum at East Tennessee State University. And we're going to be talking about the Fletcher Exhibit. So Spenser, you want to set up what is the Fletcher Exhibit and just a brief introduction?
Yes, well thank you for having me. Yes, I'm Spenser Brenner, exhibition coordinator here at the Reece Museum, and we are the proud host and venue for the Fletcher Exhibit and have been for the last 8 years. The Fletcher Exhibit, Social and Politically Engaged Art, is a national juried annual art exhibition that originated in 2013 and was first held at the Tipton Street Gallery here in downtown Johnson City. And that gallery is ran by Slocum Galleries, part of the art department here at ETSU. But since then, in 2014, we became the venue of that because it began to grow a little bit larger than what the Tipton Gallery was able to handle at the time. So since then, every year, a different juror is invited to select from hundreds of different art submissions. Artists from around the world submit their social and politically engaged artworks, and then every year a different number is selected. They travel here to the Reece Museum and they're displayed here in the two galleries. The Fletcher exhibit is a memorial of Fletcher H. Dyer, who passed away in 2009 in a motorcycle accident. Fletcher at the time was just set to graduate. It was during November, so we just recently had the anniversary of his passing. His mother, Barb, father, Wayne, who is a professor here at ETSU, taught graphic design. And his sister, Carrie, who's a professor of graphic design at High Point, North Carolina. Thought the best way to honor his memory and legacy as an artist and student was to create a platform for artists like himself. So people that are making socially and politically engaged artworks. Because Fletcher was described as someone who was really concerned with everyone's place in the world, and also his mother and father were described as sometimes as being upset with his friends not being upset. You know, it's like, what, you didn't see the news, you know? So he was kind of like pushing buttons in a way, kind of being an advocate for what he cared about. And as an artist, and we have some of his work out in the hallway as well, he cared passionately about certain issues, and he made sure to communicate that through his artwork. So that was the essence of Fletcher and what this exhibit has meant. So this is the 9th annual Fletcher exhibit. It's been going for 9 years strong. This year is the largest ever too, with 109 works from 64 different artists. 21 U.S. states, artists from 21 U.S. states are represented, and 4 international countries. So we have an artist from Iran, Ireland, Poland, and Turkey represented in this particular show. But throughout the years, we've had artists from all across almost every continent, I believe, except Antarctica right now. But yes, we get to celebrate kind of the political and social forecast and kind of the zeitgeist of what these artists are concerned about. So when you come in here and you check out the show, in many cases you will be agitated or encouraged or upset or provoked. In many cases you will be emotionally challenged by some of what you're seeing. And then also it's very celebratory, but it's a good way to kind of check in on kind of what's happening in the art world, particularly with artists that are dealing with these kind of themes and concepts. An interesting work from our artist from Iran. It's actually depicting and commenting on women's rights, but particularly what was happening in protests in 1963 in Iran. And then it's kind of interesting having that in the same gallery where here in Tennessee, we just, particularly had a big celebration about suffrage, and women's rights to vote. So you're seeing that kind of coupled with it. So that a very American, very kind of Tennessee, very much a story. That many of our colleagues and museums have all, I think, touched on, as they should. And that there's 2 or 3 works on just American suffrage, but having that kind of, for lack of better words, juxtaposed with American concepts. Yes, and then our artist from Poland is dealing with kind of her perspective of where Poland is, and kind of and then how much power Russia has. So those kind of diplomatic conflicts in Europe that we don't, in many cases, or as myself, I'm not as exposed to as much in my daily routine of news or intake or pop culture. So yes, it's an eye-opening experience for even those who are aware of these issues.
Yes. So one thing about how this thing comes together, how does, like layout-wise, so you've got 2 galleries. So if you've got a piece from Iran and a piece from Tennessee, like do you try to link it out thematically, or is it just based on like how big things are? Like what does that look like?
That's an interesting question and a good one too, because that's kind of the conflict I have as the installer, pseudo curator of the exhibit. I've had the benefit of doing it for the last 8 years, so I think I've gotten to almost a formula of how I particularly handle this show. I've tried laying things out due to concept, but then as I was doing it, I felt inappropriate. And I felt like I was projecting kind of my thoughts. And then I was like, well, if I put all of the things dealing with what I think is, femininity in, versus masculinity, or if I put all the police brutality concepts, then I was like, well, then I'm creating bubbles and groups within these things. So I can take a step back and I look at it aesthetically, compositionally, and size. So if you're a large, commanded piece, you're going to go in what I call an anchor spot. So when you come into the museum, there's only certain ways you can navigate. So if you walk in and hit to the right, I want you to see like, all right, well, that's really colorful. Now I'm going to put something neutral next to that. And then after I get that layout generally done, then I take another step back and look at, all right, well, what are the concepts that are being dealt with? And then I read artist statements. And then particularly for this show, it was the largest. So there's over 50 works in each gallery. And some spaces are, works are only separated by inches. Yeah. And you're like, all right, well, how do I allow them to breathe and kind of be as impactful as they really are on their own? So one, I try to do the individual justice, but also aesthetically, I want to do the show justice. But so far, that formula gets tweaked here and there. But yeah, as far as what things are being dealt with inside, or visually with each artwork, I take no bearing on that. I kind of just, what size, what color. I do, particularly for this show, I tried to group the same artist together.
Okay.
So if you had 2 works come in, I tried to put yours 2 together.
Okay.
For instance, this artist, Allison Johnson, has her 2 works together. But this other artist, I think Kim Clave, it just worked aesthetically because, all right, well, these neutrals, even though they're dealing with very different subject matter, sometimes very national, but obviously a critique over there of politics, but how those kind of work aesthetically is kind of more of my concern. And then you get to read in, and sometimes I'm delightfully surprised at how well these 2 might communicate conceptually.
Yeah.
But yeah, starting with the visual, that's my go-to.
Well, that's interesting, because one of the things I like to describe to people about putting an exhibit together, it's like doing a research paper plus a jigsaw puzzle. So aesthetics are a really important part. Now for me, I deal most with history exhibits, so there's a lot more like concept and theme, like grouping stuff that way. But aesthetics does play a role. But I always fall back, Randy Sanders, the former director here at the Reece Museum, we did a collaborative exhibit with the Reece a couple of years ago, and we were helping with the installation. And one of we were hanging pieces, and we were like, well, how do you, what do you think? Like, how do you get this in here? And he's like, just eye it. And it was such a simple thing, but when you're dealing with art, like sometimes it is more aesthetic. And he was like, don't overthink it. Even if it doesn't line up perfectly, if it looks right to your eye, then it should look fine. So yeah, I think
it's across the board. What I've always kind of said is that many museum professionals, particularly on the side, who are the visual side of things, we're working harder for you not to notice things than we are for you to notice things. So in many cases, and I have the benefit of experience too, but yeah, most Fletchers, I literally measure out, line everything up, and I have like a midline for everything, which is the same in here. I use 60 as a midline, and that tends to work, and ADA compliant, people in wheelchair can experience it just as much as someone who was tall can experience it. But for this show, because of the nature of it, because the juror, Michael Ray Charles, was dealing with a hurricane in Houston, trying to juror this, everything got pushed back a week. So I actually installed this within 3 days.
Oh, wow.
Without 6 of the, well, no, I think it was 3 of the works that's still yet to arrive. So I was like, all right, well, the paintings from Poland are coming in because the customs and I think in Amsterdam are holding them up or something like that. It was a little bit convoluted for those. But I had to kind of just pick and choose. So I was hanging works and just like, okay, hanging this right and then making it work. And that's just it. It's like, well, if time is limited, I don't have the luxury of measuring everything out. Make it happen. And I also have the benefit of having Randy Sanders as a mentor for a number of years. So yes, sometimes he's just like, take a breath, just do it, and then life will go on. And so sometimes, it's it's a little bit of relaxation and just letting it flow. Yeah. And then people will come in and they'll never know how much I was fretting over that inch or two, or well, I really wish there was 2 lights on this, not 3. But no, so it's kind of like, all right.
The exhibit, as you mentioned, is very, very much centered on political issues, current events. So it touches on a lot of, I guess, controversial topics, and there's a lot of, at times, graphic images, not necessarily just in this one, but that's a recurring theme. So I did want to touch on a couple of things before we wrap up completely. How do you approach these topics, which are very confrontational, and the exhibit is kind of confrontational? So how do you approach those topics, and how do you prepare people that are coming into the exhibit that haven't maybe necessarily seen it before? Like how do you handle those things?
Yeah, one, we have the benefit of being a part of ETSU, part of a university campus community. Mm-hmm. And I think there's some inherent things that we kind of have being part of that community. We're a place of education, community, learning and sharing ideas. Okay. And if that's not the ethos of Fletcher, I don't know what is. So that too, and it's just, we as a museum, myself and Becca, our interim director, we're the venue and host, so we try ourselves. Of course, we have opinions, and we have our own political leanings, like any other American would, or what you would expect. And just how I was talking about how we put the show up, we're not putting the one that we don't agree with over here in the corner. We're putting what we think aesthetically fits the best place. The Fletcher exhibit is its own entity. Just as, for instance, if you were to have an art exhibit where it was all about Joe's opinions, the Reece would be hosting it, but we necessarily might not share those opinions. But as a museum, we try to be equitable, and then we have an advisory committee that advises on all exhibitions. But with this being an annual one and a different juror every year, we kind of keep that distinction of kind of separate. We are not choosing these artworks. We aren't necessarily making an opinion on these artworks. The Reece Museum does give out an award for the Reece Museum Award to one of the artists within the Appalachian Regional Commission. That's kind of the political map that we use. And then we invite people from the center and even our student workers. So it's kind of almost a fun exercise for us to be able to kind of pick collectively what we think should get an award. So we have our opinion as an institution is there. Yeah. But then for everyday public that comes in, we introduce the exhibit just how I kind of did to you. The Fletcher exhibit is social and politically engaged artworks, and you're an adult and you have the right to view it, you have the right to have a reaction to it, you have the right not to come back or not to view it or turn around. We also have another gallery, so we're an art and history museum, so in many cases we have another art exhibit or another history exhibit. And in this case, we actually have 3 exhibits that are spaced throughout the museum. So if you come in and you personally, this is not something you want to be a part of or experience, completely you're right. We do have other things that might be for you. But again, we never have a permanent exhibit, so it's kind of, you're not going to like everything, or you're not going to love everything. If we do have minors that come in, our staff and student worker staff are all trained to, again, introduce the exhibit, the Fletcher Exhibit, social and politically engaged artworks. As the parent or guardian of a minor, you might want to check out the show before your minor does. In many cases, the next question is why? And I repeat myself, it's politically and socially engaged artwork. You might want to check out the show. But we do not give any trigger warnings. We do not place any sort of label on the exhibit. That's not our place, and we agree with the co-directors on that.
Which, could you explain, because I had never thought about this, and you mentioned it before we started, as we started talking, sort of one of their reasonings for not doing it. It's a really good reason.
Yeah, because at first, you're just like, oh, we'll just tell people that there might be nudity, or hey, just tell people that there might be death scenes, or some kinds, violence against women, or some people that there's some trauma, that can be brought up. But whenever we were having a discussion with the co-directors about trigger warnings, or about signage, or about curtains, or about what the case may be, Barb Dyer basically made the point that she's triggered every time she hears an ambulance because of the death of her son, Fletcher. So why should she ask all ambulances to not turn on the sirens around her? Just as many of the artwork is meant to push your buttons, just like Fletcher's artwork was, or it's meant to kind of take you aback. We would be taking that away from the artwork by doing that. Now, we take it all with a grain of salt when it comes to, minors, and also we're a community museum. You might just pop in, not expecting to have a conversation about race and police with your young, or your class, or what have you. So anytime we know that someone, that is clearly below the age of 18 or a minor, that's the most that we will preface. It's like it's social and political.
Yeah.
And then in many cases, 9 times out of 10, or even I would say 19 out of 20, whatever the case, but they come in and are like, oh no, they need to be exposed. And there's kind of this is a time to have those conversations. One of the first shows that we did here in 2014, and Elliot Earls was the juror on that. The president, Brian Nolan, was here with his young son, and going around and explaining, things that had very vulgar, words on them, and well, here's what this artist is communicating. So it's an educational experience, but again, we want to just kind of do our part too, particularly for very, very young ones. It's just a matter of like, hey, do you
have these conversations?
And then sometimes it's like, all right, well, I'll just come back on my own, or but again, most of the time it's like, no, this is a great opportunity. It's a great educational experience, and even if they're coming from a place of not agreeing with what this art is, it's like people are out there, ideas are out there, and this is a place to see a lot of them all in one place. So it can be overwhelming. And then sometimes on the other side of it too, if you have been dealing with something personally in your life, or if you do have trauma, in some cases, this can be, this might bring it up, and it's not for me to say if that's, positive or negative, but it is what it is in many cases. So yeah, we've had a positive general experience from everyone who does come in and see the show, and then you kind of would get what you'd expect too. So we're very aware of our area and political leanings as well. But again, it's been supported from all sides, or at least in my experience. We haven't had that blowback. But us being the venue too, in many cases, some people might have a case with the Fletcher Exhibit, but not the Reece Museum. But we're honored to be the host, and we're proud to be the host.
Which, that the way that you've described how you put this together really speaks to the role of museums anyway, in general, right? Because, this is the way we approach our exhibits. Like, we don't necessarily put our thoughts, our opinions out there. We're a space to, spark discussion. We don't want to give you our viewpoint or our meaning. We're going to present facts or artifacts, items, whatever, and then phrase it in a way that you're going to think about it. And maybe think about it in a way you hadn't thought about it before, or when you leave this exhibit, you're going to have a discussion with somebody, and maybe it's, you know, someone that you haven't had a discussion with before. Like you mentioned, you had a class in here one time, and some of the students stayed after the class was over, and they were just still talking about the pieces. That's what museums try to do. Like, we try to be, you know, providers of space for community and discussions, instead of like, we're not the arbiters of truth, we're just a place to discuss this stuff. So.
Yeah, so it's interesting too, the amount of interpretation like the Chesterian would have to do in a historical context. For this particular exhibit, it's just how do you arrange it to not put that spin on it.
Yeah.
Particularly, you know, because, you know, this work has its own spin, this one has its own thing, this one has its own thing. So it's kind of like, well, all the interpretation is done, I just got to make sure it's safely put on the wall in an appropriate way. But yeah, it is kind of like, and I love going to conferences and learning how that is, and you know, that kind of school of thought too, and it's interesting just being in museums the short time I have, which is almost 10 years, but not quite there. How different places, you know, communities deal with what's going on too. So we deal with that too on a part of the time, not as much sometimes as, you know, Jonesboro and the Heritage Alliance are, you know, are always, you're prolific in your history exhibits, but
well, that's what we do.
So, but then too, you know, there's the political atmosphere, and like sometimes like, okay, well, this, you know, one side obviously lost, or one, you know, well, here's what it is. So, but I can appreciate that. But yeah, it's kind of a tricky line too. There has been times where I've had students, mostly, you know, young students of ETSU, come in for a tour, and it's clear that something has triggered them. They're angry with something that they have seen and the fact that it's being put on display, and they want to kind of push buttons, or they'll ask me like, well, what about this? Or they'll get a little test, and I have my responses, which you normally, you know, put them down without, you know, putting them down. And it's just my go-to for certain works too. I'm always gaining an appreciation, and you can do that without getting angry or violent.
Disarm and discuss.
It's just like, hey, you know, sometimes I get upset when I don't understand things too. You know? So, and that normally makes them swallow their pride a little bit. And they're like, oh yeah, well, you know, I'm getting whipped up. I should maybe read the artist statement or understand why it makes me angry. You know, why does this make you happy, and understand why. You know, so it's and you'll walk away knowing a little bit more about yourself, and something that you detested did that for you. So. But again, I don't want to end on detesting, but most of the things are positive, and again, we just, it's the whole, even though we're dealing with sometimes war, death, violence, you know, political divide, misogyny, racism, there's a positive thing to come out of it. Just, you know, another example, museum exhibits dealing with the Holocaust, or horrible, you know, historical things that have happened, but it's like, it happened, we're acknowledging it, let's be better people and move on. So I hope that's what most people take away from the Fletcher, is it's honoring someone who made this type of work, and the artists who are still making this type of work, and here's a place for these things to exist together. And every year, we'll keep going strong. Next year will be the 10th annual, so we're hoping to do some things more involved, and maybe have some of the repeat artists come back.
That'd be really cool.
So yeah, keep an eye out.
Well, thank you so much. How long is this on display for?
This is on display till December 10th. We are open Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4:30 p.m. If you follow us on Instagram or Facebook, we do every Friday is Fletcher Friday, so you can actually see, going back a number of weeks, which we'll be posting 8 artists every Friday, and we've been doing that, and we'll continue to do that until the end of the show. And then there's all these different opportunities as well to check out the show online, but always you can get in touch with the museum if you want to see it and can't physically make it out. But of course, the best way to experience the Fletcher exhibit is to be here in person. And again, Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 4:30, free and open to the public, and we would love to see you here.
And if you want to keep up with the Reece Museum in general, a lot of programs and stuff that you do, so social media is a great way to do that. All right, well, thank you so much for doing this. This was a ton of fun.
Thank you, Joe.
All right, we'll see you. Bye.